everybody. My name is Lorena Ruiz, and I'm a master's candidate in international affairs at GPIA, which is the graduate program in international affairs here at the New School. Out of a love for comedy and curiosity of its intersection with politics, I've been organizing this event for the past 6 months. It's sponsored by the Media and Culture Concentration at GPIA, and it's this year's first installment of a conversation series. Last year, the concentration held 3 events in the conversation series. The first was a conversation with journalists Ian Baruma and Gary Young. The second was a conversation with the editor of Foreign Affairs magazine, James Hogue. And the third was about the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. All of those events were videotaped and are on the New School YouTube, as this event will be. Before we begin, I'd quickly like to thank Phil Aker, Mina Keys, Diana Duarte, and Sean Jacobs for their help planning and preparing this event. I'd also like to thank our awesome panelists for agreeing to come. So, we're here to discuss the links between comedy and politics. In a moment, Sean Jacobs, the chair of the Media and Culture Concentration and professor at GPIA, will give us a little bit of the context on our topic, and he will serve as the moderator for our conversation. But first, I'd like to introduce our amazing guests. And I think I dropped half of the things I have to say on the ground, so excuse me for a second while I pick them up. Oh no, I already said these things. Don't need them. Let's start with Evan and Andrew Gregory. They are part of the musical group The Gregory Brothers, which also includes their brother Michael and Evan's wife Sarah. They are very famous for their viral videos Auto-Tune the News, which includes the recent hit The Bed Intruder song, which is on YouTube and iTunes. Next, we have Steve Almond. Steve is an author, journalist, blogger, and commentator. He's the author of some books that are story collections, such as My Life in Heavy Metal, The Evil B.B. Chow, the novel Which Brings Me to You, and the nonfiction books Candy Freak and Not That You Asked. He has a new book this year called Rock and Roll Will Save Your Life. Next, we have Baratunde Thurston. And this is straight from his blog. Baratunde exists at the intersection of comedy, politics, and technology. His official duties include web editor at The Onion, co-founder of Jack and Jill Politics, and a host of Popsi's Future Of on the Science Channel. He's currently writing How to Be Black, which will be released next year. And last but not least, we have Dan Powell. Dan is a production manager, producer, and writer at Comedy Central. In 2003, he was an associate producer for The Daily Show. In 2007 and 2008, he was an executive in charge of production on The Colbert Report. And currently, he's an executive producer and writer for the Comedy Central show Ugly Americans, which will start its new season in 1 week. I made a quick compilation of some of these videos, so let's watch them real quick before we get started. Can you make it big?
That's what they all say. All
right. So it begins.
On a sauvegardé notre marché intérieur, qui n'est pas parfait. Il faut l'approfondir, et même qui nous fera des propositions concrètes.
Yeah.
You have the charisma of a damn nag. You have the ignorance of a backpack. Who are you? I never heard you. Nobody in Europe had ever heard you. But I have no doubt that it's your intention to be the boss of you imposing.
I was confused.
Would you cross pretty much above country?
This was the scene at the Boston College commencement ceremony earlier today when students displaying anti-war messages turned their backs on Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice when she accepted an honorary degree. Joining us now, Steve Almond. He resigned his position as an adjunct professor of English in Boston College when Secretary Rice was invited to campus. Welcome aboard, sir. Thanks for being with us. Steve, I guess it's fairly obvious you probably voted for John Kerry in the last election, so does politics play any role in your position here?
I think actually morality plays a role. I just feel public officials shouldn't lie to us, especially about matters.
I got that, but did you? But you are politically a Democrat. You're politically left. You voted for John Kerry, right?
I believe that politicians shouldn't lie to the American people.
I didn't ask you that. Did you vote for John Kerry, sir?
I'm telling you that I don't believe that our public officials should lie.
I got that. You're a broken record. Now, it's a simple question. Did you vote for John Kerry?
We don't know you, we never voted you, so that you'll put it across the better.
We've covered every major event in U.S. history and world history, really. Earthquake marking the least gay day in San Francisco history. We obviously remember the great moon landing, of course, which is, everyone knows that has that headline. And of course, when George W. Bush took office, we covered his inauguration speech like no one else. Our long national nightmare of peace and prosperity is finally over, and that proves frighteningly accurate.
My understanding is, anyone in the Middle East, you're dead, right? Am I right about that?
Stephen, actually, that's not correct.
That's not correct.
No, it's actually, much to my surprise and the surprise of others, that young people in the Middle East are actually not that different from us. You're looking at
Us?
Us here in America.
Us young people like me.
Young people.
We don't want you, chicken wings, who you are. Go back to the sky, it's not what you belong. Don't make me ask for World War III. You know, these guns are WMD. We don't want you, we don't want you.
Well, I don't think I'm really the issue here. I think Condoleezza Rice and her campaign of deception and this administration's prosecution of an immoral war is the issue. There are no WMDs, so far, unless you got them there at Fox News under your desk. Over 3 years and coming up on 20,000 casualties, and the American people are getting sick of it.
You know what? If that's the case, and I suspect I'm right, and you voted for Kerry, you voted for a guy that made the exact same case as she did, what would that make you?
I'm sorry, the administration in Powell is the one that has gotten us into this mess, okay? You're not going to
John
play
Kerry,
here.
obviously the election turned out well for most, terrible for Barack Obama.
The Republicans drove our economy into a ditch. We got in there and we pushed and we shoved. And these numbers said, seminar survey. And then they got the nerve to ask for the keys back. I don't want to give them the keys back. They don't know how to drive. They don't know how to drive. I'm standing in the ditch, bitch.
So now I'd like to introduce Sean Jacobs, the chair of the Media and Culture Concentration.
And the least funny person on this panel. So I'm going to make a disclaimer right at the start, which is I'm not going to attempt to be funny or make any jokes, not with these kind of people on the stage. But what I would like to do quickly is just to sort of, I think although Lorena has been working on this for 6 months, I think there's an urgency to this panel, like as to why we would be having this panel today. If you've been reading the news, right, for the last 2 weeks or so, you've watched as Bill Maher has released like one video a week, like the first week on Christine O'Donnell, who's this Republican senatorial candidate from Delaware, where he's released these old clips from his old show, Politically Incorrect, to show off, some of her ridiculous statements. So last week he released one that she dabbled in witchcraft. This week on her views on evolution, I don't know if anybody picked this up, but she said that evolution is a myth. Because we are not witnessing monkeys evolving into humans anymore. So apart from the cheap laughs that I'm getting, what is important is that Bill Maher set the news agenda for much of last week, and I think in some sense part of this week, on cable news especially, and on news website. Then last Friday, Stephen Colbert, the host of the Colbert Report, for which Dan worked for a while, testified under oath before Congress at an immigration subcommittee hearing into the conditions of immigrant farm workers. Colbert went in the guise of his TV character. He was totally in character as a blowhard, right-wing conservative TV host. We know who he was imitating. And the congresswoman who invited him, Zoe, I'm probably mispronouncing her name, Lofgren, said she did so because Colbert would guarantee media attention for an issue that otherwise would have received little coverage. And Colbert, aware of his power, sort of mocked himself by saying, "I certainly hope that my star power can pump this hearing all the way up to C-SPAN 1." So I'm gonna get to a question in a minute. So even more significantly, at the end of next month, on October the 30th, or I think is it already this month? It's tomorrow, right? Just 3 days before the midterm election, Colbert and Jon Stewart, the latter, as we know, and I don't have to tell you this, who hosts a fake comedy news show that makes fun of cable news and public figures, are planning to hold 2 duo rallies. And I mean, we know that it's kind of one rally, right? One to a march to keep fear alive, and the second, a rally to restore sanity. Now, again, what's important about this is, you know, again, it could be a stunt. They may just be having fun on the stage. They might help their ratings. But the important thing is it's also a response to the rally held by Glenn Beck on the Mall a couple of weeks ago. So when the laughs are over and the fun's had, people again are going to wonder how many people turned up for this rally by Stephen Colbert and by Jon Stewart, and what does it mean for politics again? So just to open it up, and I know those guys aren't here, and I don't want to make this a panel about Colbert and Jon Stewart, I want to do it about your work. I think as an opening question, because of the moment that we are in, I wanted to ask you all on the panel, these guys aren't political activists, but now they are inserting themselves into the political process more directly. And I wanted to know your thoughts about this. What do you think? This is something new? What does this mean? Is it a change in our politics from merely just commenting on politics, making fun, or trying to get people's reaction to political events, or is this something entirely new? Just to get things going.
I'll speak on behalf of Glenn Beck. Couldn't be here today. He's a great comedian. I don't think it's certainly not entirely new, but the sort of intrusiveness of it, it becomes more performance art when you inject yourself into the real stream of real activities. I mean, Colbert testifying before Congress is different from Colbert speaking at the Correspondents' Dinner. And you know, there were both acts of performance art and political satire and media satire and theater, but one was sanctioned by the federal government as a part of its governing process, and the other was kind of as a jester, as a king might do in the past, bring in someone to poke fun at him, but then go about your business while I continue ruling the land. It's different, and I think one of my theories on why it's different is that we have less attention, and the level of absurdity politically has gotten so high that it doesn't seem that far-fetched. It's like, okay, well, you know, Beck is a news person, and he does a rally, and that's sort of an intentionally anger-stoking rally. We did an Onion story sort of about this guy saying, you know, nation once again falls under the sway of a pink-faced half-wit. Right? And it's like, we do this every couple of decades. Somebody gets us really excited and really angry and promises anger and not solutions. So I think, however, the injection into the real political process is quite different. I think there's an attention issue here. I think there's an absurdity of what the real events are versus how far you have to go to satirize those events, because the policies themselves are hilarious / devastating.
I'm not sure why Glenn Beck would necessarily have more authority to do a political rally than Jon or Stephen. I don't think they would consider there's a political rally. I think it's more about like making fun of the polarization of politics. But I mean, Glenn Beck he's already said numerous times, like, oh, I'm a rodeo clown, and he sort of disavowed his journalistic credits. But he's not in any, he's a talk show radio host. He was like a morning zoo guy from Florida who then sort of cleaned up his act and went into politics, but he's not a legitimate journalist. I don't think he ever claims to be. He's an editorialist, which essentially is what Jon and Stephen do as well. They just are much funnier and arguably, frankly, better at it. I mean, when you see the way The Daily Show sort of holds politicians accountable for what they've said in the past, and they have an unbelievable research team over there who remember every single thing that politicians said, and then are able to, they watch and TiVo these news channels like 24 hours a day, go back and make these montages where they're able to really hold people accountable. I think they arguably are almost better journalists than someone like Glenn Beck, so I don't know why he would necessarily be someone who could legitimately hold a rally like that, and they are not. They make the same points that he does, just, again, in a far funnier and more articulate way. A less weepy way.
Definitely less weepy.
Yeah, I don't even know that it's not even really a contest in terms of Glenn Beck versus Colbert and Stewart. I think the question is anybody in the Fourth Estate as trenchant and devoted to the truth as Stewart and Colbert, which is not to make them heroic figures. I think they essentially exist because there's a tremendous vacuum in the culture right now. There's no moral outrage amongst the population, that's you and us. There's no moral outrage in the Fourth Estate. They've essentially become, under the aegis of late model capitalism, stimulation junkies who are only concerned with whether something is going to generate views or clicks, not whether it matters morally to the political discourse. And in this tremendous vacuum, there always steps into the breach comedians to try to take stock of where we are morally. And it's not like Colbert and Stewart invented this. Aristotle talks about the comic mode and the tragic mode as if they're distinct, but Aristophanes was doing this, satirizing the absurdity and the moral lapses of the political system in ancient Greece. And you can trace it all the way through our history. The first person to take on Hitler was Charlie Chaplin, to recognize that there was this tremendous sort of monstrousness occurring. And I think actually the ascendance of comedy, and we'll keep talking about this, I hope, is the ascendance of comedy in this historical moment has to do with an absolute moral vacuum that exists in the culture. And that's all I think Colbert and Stewart are reacting to and playing off of.
I would also say that as political punditry moves closer and closer to comedy, not just with Glenn Beck, but say with a Keith Olbermann, it's inevitable that comedy would move closer and closer to political punditry.
And there must have been certainly a bit of professional jealousy on the parts of Stewart and Colbert. If Glenn Beck can hold such a successful rally, and he's a pretty funny guy in his own pink-faced way if you look at him through the right lens, certainly they must have said, well, by golly, we've got to get in on this action. And of course, as Baratunde said, I mean, there's this lengthy history of comedy and politics. It's not necessarily new to speak truth to power through comedy, but I think we'll get into this a bit more with the leverage of new media and the ability to communicate instantaneously with millions of people. The facility to create rallies like this is new, but certainly comedians in politics and having a voice in politics is nothing new. And Abraham Lincoln, I think, was a wonderful stand-up in his own day, and you just don't hear about that anymore. He had such a different legacy.
I mean, the follow-up question was gonna be that you've always had comedians in this country who were funny, but also were political. Lenny Bruce, Richard Pryor, George Carlin. But is there something else going on now? Like is it? I know you mentioned there's a moral vacuum. There's less attention. There's this kind of you have to be more absurd. But you sort of kind of threw that out there already. Is it this media age that we live in? Like that you can actually produce. I mean, you produce media now.
Thank you. I think.
Yeah. I mean, you're not waiting anymore for. It goes straight onto the web. There's no massive company that you have to wait for. I know that those guys are on like a network, but is the fact that there's all this new media out, is that helping to change this process? Is it making it more intense?
Well, I mean, I can answer that just from personal experience in terms of, making what some might call media. We are our own production house. If we think of an idea, no matter how dumb it is, we are able to put it out immediately without anyone saying, that's kind of a dumb idea. You might want to think twice about that. So whatever song or piece of music. I mean, we originally kind of came at our series from a musical standpoint, and then if people happen to find it insightful or comedic, then kudos to them. But that's absolutely been a game changer in terms of the ability for anyone to insert their voice into the conversation, and if it has novelty or value to it, it can spread of its own accord.
Yeah, I think you'll find that most people who work in comedy definitely place the importance of the laugh over the actual political message. They want to make sure that the joke connects before necessarily the satire.
I think there's also, I mean,
because we're insecure.
I totally stepped on your point. I'm really sorry.
It's all right.
Jesus. Back to Steve's point about the role of media. You can't separate the politics from the media, and the level of conversation we have is determined still largely by those who have the biggest microphones. And in this country, it's one of the only jobs guaranteed by the Constitution to exist is journalism, is this fourth estate concept. So you have a very high bar of responsibility and duty that isn't being met, which creates this vacuum that you talked about. You also have a flood of information because it's so much easier for lots of people to put things out or to put something out in even a more timely fashion. So it doesn't take weeks to produce something relevant. It takes hours, minutes, seconds sometimes, depending on the medium. If you're talking about Twitter, you can do it before it happens because it's so fast. But I think the speed and your ability to hook a comedic note onto an actual event is much more applicable today than when you had to write an essay out and photocopy it and hand distribute it through people on street corners. So you can be a larger part of the conversation and compete with those who are failing to guide us through that conversation.
Anybody else wanted to comment?
I was just going to say, even though The Daily Show and The Colbert Report have a larger microphone, you can just look at the function of social media in making the Rally for Sanity as big as it is.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, look at how long people had to plan rallies for in the past, and even look at how long Glenn Beck had to plan his rally for because he's working with an older audience who's not going to be on Facebook and Twitter as much, where Colbert and Stewart have said, hey, how about next month? And that's really soon.
It works for me.
It's crazy. Like, how long were they planning the Million Man March? You know, that was planned for like at least a full year.
10,000 years.
You know?
Yeah.
10,000 years.
Yeah. It's part of evolution.
Okay, well, I have a question about the link between comedy and politics. How does comedy influence politics? Are jokes about politicians, do they create the politician's image, or do they reflect what people already believe? And as to what Steve was saying earlier, does political comedy lead people to be more critical about what's going on, or just more cynical?
Well, I'm going to go out on, I think, a little bit of a limb. I love Jon Stewart and Colbert. I love their programs. And I don't have a TV, but the one thing that my wife and I watch, if we do get any time at the end of the day to watch, is we'll watch one of those two programs. Partly because I think people recognize that the traditional forms of media, the fourth estate, the idea that you comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, has sort of degenerated into what comfort the distracted and distract the comfortable, something like that. And that Stewart and Colbert are sort of holding to account morally these political actors and the media folks who are treating American people as if they're really sort of stupid and obedient and uninterested in their own in their own civic culture and political discourse. The problem is that I oftentimes worry that I feel in a weird way that watching those programs is kind of my registering my vote, if you know what I mean. I feel in a weird way morally satisfied when I have had all those idiots pointed to intelligently and in a very funny way by Colbert and Stewart. And that is different than actually being a moral actor in the world. That's different than working on a campaign or advocating for an issue or doing whatever little decisions that you're supposed to do as a citizen of the country in order to try to make sure our kids aren't completely fucked and basically chased down by diesel mobs in Mad Max garb. And I'm curious to ask other people on the panel about this, especially folks who just is that, I oftentimes worry about that those programs are so smart, but in a sense, the laugh is where it ends. That sense of, well, we all are the intelligent ones who know how absurd Fox News is and the political right in this country, and therefore we're in a weird way, that's it. We've had our laugh, and we feel morally in the right, and we don't have to actually do anything more than that.
I mean, I think certainly with an Onion hat on, there is no extra expectation of our audience to do anything except keep reading The Onion and clicking on all of our advertisements on our website repeatedly. So I do identify with the sense of self-satisfaction because you're like, yeah, but when your team does that. I think one of the things that, actually probably Daily Show does this as well too, is try to not make it always a particular political angle. Right? So you're not comforting the same group of people every time. I mean, the hate mail that we get is from everybody. That's because everybody loves us until they hate us. And there's one story that just rubs them the wrong way. Like, The Onion used to be really funny until it picked on my pet peeve, and now I hate you guys, and blah, 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 blah.
I wonder what Glenn Beck thinks of you now, because he was a big fan of yours. He had, like, links to you guys on his site. He was like, he followed you on Twitter, and you've just... That video you guys did where a woman in an accident, tragically not Glenn Beck.
Yeah.
And then the pink-faced half one. You guys just mock him relentlessly, and he takes himself so seriously now. I wonder how he feels about the Onion.
I mean, he still follows us on Twitter. We have a daily script that checks. And I think Glenn Beck is very conscious of what Glenn Beck is. And I think this is based on nothing, but I just gotta believe he's 60% acting. Right? And he's committed himself, he put himself in a box, he's walked himself into a corner, he's painted himself in there. So he's got to keep doing it. But he also knows he's a theater guy.
I hope he is, because if it is even partially an act, he's the most brilliant satirist of all time.
He may also be psychologically troubled. These things can go together and often do. But yeah, I mean, we've certainly hit him. We've attacked Biden for weirdness, because he's nowhere to be found. Right? This is like Biden in trouble with White House for recording Hennessy ads. Shirtless Biden caught washing Camaro in White House driveway. It's like, what is this with Uncle Joe? Like, what is this guy doing? He's like that crazy, dirty uncle. And I said, what are you doing, dude? I'm distracting you from the original point, but...
That's all right. That's kind of making my point, actually.
I like being distracted by shirtless Biden.
But I do think, I mean, the primary goal of these outlets isn't activism on the part of the audience.
Right.
So it is entertainment first.
Yeah.
I guess I'd also say that even if Stewart and Colbert tried to sort of do this like, oh, we're not picking a side sort of thing, they aren't doing a great job of it. And so I think the comedy that comes out of other sources, I think, is much more successful at actually making change. Like, you might look at Colbert and Stewart and be like, all right, it's the same, a million people watching that show every night who already agree with them. But, like, look at the effect that Tina Fey's impersonation of Sarah Palin had in the last election. Like, I can't remember a time in my lifetime that a comedian had as much of an effect on an election. And it's because it was coming from Saturday Night Live that you don't watch thinking like, oh, this super liberal news show. It's just a comedy sketch show.
That is one thing politicians have to watch out for, is that sort of the essence of comedy is taking, especially like impressions and things like that, is taking the most sort of... Oh, sorry. My fault.
I have to tweet that right
down.
now. I am tweeting the hell out of that.
Area man does not make efficient use of his microphone.
You do not make efficient use of your... I want to auto-tune that.
I need her in my life.
Let's auto-tune that.
All right. That's my new, that'll be my Facebook status. Dan Powell did not make efficient use of his microphone. Well, it's, you actually are tweeting it.
I'm not lying.
But because, sort of the nature of comedy is taking the most absurd thing about someone, or at least what is perceived as the most absurd thing, and then just hammering that home, SNL can very quickly, define someone as, Bill Clinton as a philanderer, or I remember George Bush originally, when Will Ferrell did his impression, if anyone remembers, it was as a total cokehead. It wasn't as an idiot. That was the thing, I'm a cokehead frat boy, and if you go back and look at the early episodes, it's a totally different impression. And they decided, this isn't the angle that seems to be catching on. I guess it's funnier if he's just a moron. But it sticks. I mean, those one things that comedians decide to make fun of you about, like McCain being old or things like that, it can actually start to have an effect on how people perceive those politicians.
I think there are certain quotes still attributed to George W. Bush that he never uttered and were in fact made up by Will Ferrell. That's not a joke.
I don't want to stay on the sort of serious tip, but there is this sort of question that the stakes are high. Right? This is sort of to channel what Steve's saying. The stakes are high. You get laughs. You critique, but if there's two wars, right? In Iraq, there's an economic recession. There's all this stuff about Obama's doing nothing. So in that context, these guys are going to go to the mall. And there are. I mean, if you look on Twitter and if you look on Facebook, there are people saying, I'm going to be there. They've invested in this event. So there is this thing in which you are, I know, I'm laughing too. I love watching these shows. I was watching a lot of the auto-tune stuff today and was like, wow, this is brilliant. But like at the end, there is sort of this moment where in the United States, there's always this issue about social movements and their ability to make changes. So you have Obama, he gets into power, the election is over, and then it dies down. And now the Tea Party they know how to do that now. They're doing the sort of Obama thing of 2008. So I just want to know about that response. Is there like a sense of like, the stakes are high, the social movements are kind of dead. Do we take this up? Is it our job to, which is what some of the people, if you watch on Facebook and Twitter, that's how they read this rally that's coming up in DC.
I'm just waiting for the Whig party to come back into style, but I'm gonna jump back in.
I mean, to be fair, in my opinion, the stakes have always been high, right? Every year the stakes are always the fate of our nation and our world.
No, but it's true this time.
Yeah.
Like it's really, really important.
I heard that 2012 is going to be a big year for the Mayans.
I think people will be making a political statement just by showing up to Jon and Stephen's rally, but I don't think the rally, I think Jon and Stephen will just look to entertain people for 3 hours and, get laughs. But I do think that a lot of people just want to show up to that rally just as like sort of an FU to Glenn Beck, see if we can get more people on the mall than Glenn did, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, my motive, like, I feel the same way, and then there's the other part of me that's kind of the didactic, earnest, moralizing, not funny part of me that says, actually, I think probably my resources are better spent worrying about what's going to happen in the election 5 days later. And it's not a matter of, I don't give a shit about political orientation. I'm concerned about, because I've got a 1.5-year-old and an almost 4-year-old. So I have real skin in the game, and you all either do or will probably at some point. And it's a real question of like, are we going to just amuse ourselves to death, or is there going to be some moral consequence to, and I think comedians can be, and comedy can be instrumental in this. I think when Colbert got up at that correspondence dinner, it was a sea change moment, because a morally irresponsible politician was being dressed down in public in a way that he never had been. It reflected a larger sense of unease amongst the people who had elected him. Really, we all did it. If he's elected, we were all responsible in one way or another. That really, he was a dangerous character, and that his folly was really the nation's tragedy. And I think, I don't call them Jon and Stephen, I'm still going to refer them as Stewart and Colbert. I think do act as a kind of a conscience, a sort of moral backstop. But the fact that a couple of guys on Comedy Central are acting as that moral backstop is speaking to a much larger crisis in sort of how the Fourth Estate operates. I keep waiting for the traditional Fourth Estate to grow a fucking conscience and stop being kicked around by Colbert and Stewart and start behaving in a way where they focus on what their job is, the actual policy consequences, things that matter to their viewers ostensibly, rather than trafficking in the kind of infotainment that is really these guys' job. They're great at it. It's their job. But, if you have somebody from a newspaper or a television station, allegedly a real news organization, they would be spending as much time fucking talking about and aggrandizing Sarah Palin and Glenn Beck as these guys do because it's their job, if you know what I mean.
I would follow up on that a little bit with the rally. I think part of the other side of what you're saying as well, like if you get 300,000 people to this rally, or however many people you get, it's a success and it's also a weird success. Because you're like, oh, that's great. You showed up for a fake rally, for a fake movement, and you could have, I don't know, written someone, knocked on a door and canvassed for an issue. But they're different things, right? And it's just, I think the positive that it does, and this is where I think there is still a contribution, so much of what we talk about and so many of our decisions are bound by the acceptable range of conversation. So when we look at the healthcare bill, right? You had a range of conversation that could have been single-payer, European-style system over here versus some super business-friendly, tax-cut, Republican-oriented thing over here with like shares in the stock market and shares in your HMO and all kinds of funky stuff. And instead, we had sort of super watered-down, possible public option, and like kill your grandma, right? And so we ended up like here because that was the little range of acceptable conversation. So compromise was already compromised by an illegitimate, far spectrum here. So when you have a Glenn Beck rally, and that's the story, that every day it's the Tea Party is super legitimate. People are so angry. The country's angry. Obama's not doing anything. You dilute the effect of that message by moving the spectrum this way. So you know what? Our fake rally got as many people, or more people, or half as many people, whatever it is. And so that's still important, even though it's not people actually canvassing for a specific political issue. It does change the acceptable range of debate, which hopefully affects the acceptable range of real outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And I would also say that if the rally is successful, which I expect it to be, to a degree, it makes a political statement, which is a complaint about what you're complaining about, which is the Fourth Estate. It's saying news sucks so much that our fake news has more fans. So you should make your news better so you can have a rally as awesome as us.
But by the way, the Onion's iPhone app is number 10 in the news category, consistently, for like all summer. So there.
I know what
you can make it number 1. Actually, we launched at number 1, but we.
Actually, I think it would be. I think there's probably really interesting people with interesting comments in the audience. I think unless Lorena has a question.
I mean, should we ask the international affairs question?
If you want to.
Oh, this is going to be hilarious.
Because it's not 7 yet, so I mean, we'll do one last question and then we'll open it up. Okay, so.
But if you ask this question, no one who is international can ask a question after that. Only Americans can ask questions after.
So we've spent all this time talking about Glenn Beck and Sarah Palin and whoever, but what about international politics? We're criticizing domestic policy, but what about in the end? Like, would you guys side up with U.S. policy? Like, I just saw Kel Penn went with the USO to do some shows around the world. And do you see your work going out to a foreign audience? Does your influence travel abroad?
No, for me. Yes, for them.
I went down to Israel right after the election in 2008, and I can't speak for other channels, but they watch crazy amounts of Comedy Central in Israel. They knew more about Comedy Central shows than I did, and I'd worked for the network for 10 years. And that country is fascinating as far as their TV industry goes, because the country's smaller than the state of New Jersey. And so the TV market is literally about 300 people who work all on the same streets, like the TV district in Tel Aviv. And they have comedians there, because I'm Jewish, and Jews naturally gravitate towards comedy. So obviously in Israel, they're
super comedians.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, especially with the constant specter of possible terrorist attack lingering over your head, it just makes you, and I think, inherently funnier because you've got to deflate that situation with humor. Right. But they have these very low budget sketch comedy shows in Israel. And it's a handful of people putting these shows up. But then they'll get really edgy, and then every now and then. It'll get international attention because they'll make fun of an issue that offends Palestinians or something like that, and it'll be all over CNN, and it'll blow up, and then all of a sudden the Prime Minister of Israel is apologizing for a skit, and it's almost like a college sketch group did something that got like international attention, because that's how small the industry is there, and that's how you know, with just the echo chamber of the media, how some tiny little thing that they do for essentially what is almost like a public access level television show can then blow up and like affect international relations between like say the peace process.
I would say absolutely yes. Onion's been around since 1756, so it's been a long time to affect the world stage. But a couple of thank
This
you
is why I
for
did
listening.
not ask that question.
But a couple of serious examples. We did a story which I think, in terms of web traffic, will be one of our top 5 stories we've done for the past year, if not beyond that. And it was man already knows everything he needs to know about Muslims. And that story got shared, you know, so much, almost as big as the New York story, and I'm sure a lot of you saw, because it connected. It basically spoke to this idea when the mosque was, the Islamic Cultural Center was really hot in the debate. This story just put it out there, like, it doesn't matter. People didn't care about the facts. They didn't care who owned the land. I said no more foreign questions. What is that?
Somebody's rocking some.
Am I being heckled by a ringtone? Is that?
It's Jefferson Starship, I think.
It's amazing. Anyway, that story also trafficked highly in overseas, especially in Arab and Islamic countries, because they saw this news outlet, you know, kind of calling it like it is. And it was a really, you know, straightforward piece. The one that resonated even more in terms of overseas is we did a story called Mexico Killed in Drug War. Like, everybody, just 111 million people dead in a massive shootout. And that story was picked up by most major Mexican media outlets. And they couched it. They said, you know, the satire organization, The Onion in the U.S. is known for doing this and this and this. And they were getting thousands and thousands of comments because there's such a frustration in that country about what's going on there and about America's role in fueling that, because it's our drug demand, which is ultimately the on and off switch for that situation. And that was also covered in the story. So like, we don't see the story, the Mexican story in our news that much. But it's, you can't, you know, you're living in fear down there. You have people being killed. I mean, it's pretty horrible. So for a comedy outlet to kind of, again, throw it out there more directly than the media can or is willing to or is able to, has certainly affected international peoples.
One of my favorite things, and this tends to happen at least once a year, is seeing stories about international or, you know, in other countries, them misinterpreting your stories as if they're real. Like you did that story about Congress threatens to leave Washington unless they get a new Capitol building.
Right,
Like it's a sports team asking for a new stadium, and China picked it up and took it seriously and used it to like mock the government.
Well, the thing with that story, Congress was demanding a retractable dome on the Capitol, or they would like move the Capitol. And this Chinese business paper, really, you know, upright kind of place in theory, they plagiarized the story. So that was their problem. They plagiarized something that was fake. They didn't understand the concept of satire when they were stealing. They stole the graphics and everything. So finally it came about, they realized it was false, and they issued a statement saying, well, according to our research, some small American newspapers like to publish lies in order to make money, which was a fairly accurate description of what we do. So I think it was like a win-win weird situation.
We have gotten we have had some international success. I don't know if we mainly do American news. If you ever want to feel bad about yourself, just talk to a Canadian or a Swede or someone from the UK about American history, and they'll know a lot more than you do. So I think that's a lot of our success. As we have done international stories, we see sort of it really light up in that country. And I guess the real highlight for me was a fan in Sweden sent us a TV interview with the Prime Minister of Sweden in which he discussed his shame in only getting second best unintentional singer in a video. This is a real actual video you can watch on YouTube where he's like, I was glad to get, you know, runner up, but I really thought I'd outdone. I can't remember. I think Hugo Chavez was the best unintentional singer in that video. He said, I really think the next time I can do it.
That's, you know, there's one more quick example of people who are doing their own versions. When you talked about, you know, the TV street in Tel Aviv, but there are satirical news outlets popping up. I mean, I know the Netherlands has a very popular one. The New York Times just featured one in Colombia. and talked about how, with Chavez really cutting down on press freedoms, that this outlet was still going right at him, but sideways because it was humor and satire, was able to say things that the traditional press was afraid to say or strictly wasn't allowed to.
Right.
Yeah.
So we go to the audience. I think there's a whole bunch of hands. So if you can identify yourself, and no long speeches, but make a I'm not pointing at you. Make a comment, ask a question, but not another presentation. Thank you.
I was just wondering, as far as the rally, since we've talked about that quite a bit, if anyone sees that as sort of an outlet that people could utilize for actually bringing about some kind of moral conscience, so actually making people mad about these things, but actually talking about specific issues. And if you think that, I know Colbert and Stewart will probably, stick to entertaining people, but if we can see that as an outlet or a way in order to start the dialogue or create a dialogue between people who clearly are upset about what's going on in our country.
I would like to praise you for making efficient use of that microphone.
Nice.
I think we mentioned a couple times up here, or we referred to the rally a few times as a fake rally, which I think is a bit duplicitous in the sense that it will be a real rally with actual people attending.
Touché.
But in addition, the title, the Rally to Restore Sanity, is rooted in truth or a true message, where the overarching theme of The Daily Show for a long time has been, look at all this silly stuff that's going on. We can make fun of it and bring it to your attention. And he's going to pursue that theme further in this rally. But that's a very real message, even though he's guaranteed to entertain and do that in a funny way. It surely will bring attention to the way issues are presented in Congress and also on cable news and in politics in unhelpful ways. So I think the people that will attend the rally are going there to be entertained, yes, but they're also going there with an expectation to connect with other people of like-minded frustration. And I expect outcomes to happen. It's going to be very close to the election time frame, and sentiments will still be running high after the rallies for people that attended. There will be a lot of coverage surrounding it. Certainly in the realm of cable news, maybe not broadcast, but there's been a sort of symbiotic, if adversarial relationship between Colbert and Stewart and all of the cable news networks across the political spectrum, in which it becomes a bit self-serving, in which they're actually just reporting themselves in a sense, and it becomes more of a soap opera rather than a journalistic enterprise.
Or a circle jerk.
One might say it's more entertainment about the personalities involved than it is the issues. What did Jon Stewart say today? Oh, but what did Sean Hannity say?
But what did Glenn Beck say about Sean Hannity?
What did Keith Olbermann say? But that has created. Pardon me while I return to my discourse. One thing that Steve said that really resonated with me was the vacuum that's left by that kind of conversation for journalistic pursuits to enter into that vacuum. And broadcast news provides that in terms of fact-checking and real people with real journalism degrees and that sort of thing, but they don't necessarily control the new media conversation and the buzz. So Comedy Central, by providing even some modicum of that fact-checking and research, has begun to step a little bit in that vacuum, like you discussed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's very tricky. I think these guys are in a tricky spot. Dan will probably have more to say about this, but I hope. Their bread and butter is to be comedians. And I'm sure in their writer's room, what matters is what generates the laugh. It so happens that what generates laughs essentially is the velocity of truth. When something is truthful in a quicker way than we're used to, our reaction is to laugh. Or when we recognize that there's sort of like tragedy is direct apprehension of the circumstances that should induce sorrow. And comedy is what we use to live with that sorrow. So I think these guys have a very serious role, but they are very careful to not get up on a soapbox, because then they become the people that they're satirizing. And everybody knows that the earnest, you should do this, you should do that message, people just click off. The reason they click on Colbert and Stewart is because they want somebody to make less the grief of the circumstance we're in. That being said, Stewart and Colbert have both, in particular moments, revealed how they really feel. And that testimony in front of the, talking about immigration, Colbert came out of character for about a minute and said basically, I'm interested in powerless people. I'm interested in people who have no power in the process. And that's what migrant workers are. We rely on them. He really spoke truth about what was happening, but it was an awkward moment. And it was awkward in the same way it's awkward when Stewart comes on O'Reilly's show or Crossfire and says, you guys are fucking monkeys and you're flushing this country down the toilet. And everybody goes, hey, bow tie fucking dickwad, whatever his name is, goes, hey, funny guy. Why are you getting so mad?
Tucker Dickwad Carlson.
Right.
Okay,
Fucker Carlson says, well, why are you getting all upset, funny man? Make another joke. So it's this very strange. I think that I hope that they have in mind a 95% ha-ha funny rally that's targeting the hypocrisy and the sort of crudity of the political theater in this country, but that 5% will convey the message that elections matter and policies matter and they make a real difference. I think that balance, though, has to be almost entirely comedy with a little bit of PSA at the end. Somewhere.
Have you considered publicly resigning as a Stewart or Colbert viewer if they don't hit the 5% mark?
I'm not ready to make an announcement. But I'm curious, what do you think? I mean, you've worked on those shows, so how would you advise them, or kind of how they think and feel a little bit off stage about those, how they balance?
Do they feel furry?
I think there's The Daily Show is less about politics than it more is about like media responsibility.
Hypocrisy.
And Jon, Jon calls out, obviously, people when Obama got elected, it was the conversation about The Daily Show was like, oh my God, what is he going to do without Bush to make fun of? And it's like, it really hasn't been about Bush. It's been about how like Fox News treats, has this double standard. And it's like, obviously his attention has turned very much to Fox News since the election, because they've just I think Barack Obama getting elected broke the right's brains. I think it's truly
the whites
they
or the
don't
rights.
The rights. Did I
and
say
the
whites?
You might have
said rights. He's messing.
All right. But honestly, I think if Jon has any agenda besides making people laugh, which I think is the biggest one, it's just it really is to be like, can't we just have reasonable discussions without going completely insane on both sides? Because both sides do really tend to, especially as one side gets crazier, the other tries to compensate by going even crazier on their end, and it's obviously counterproductive. And that was the point he made on Crossfire when he was there, several, God, it was like 2002 or 2003 or something like that. Yeah, that was the point he made there, which is like this whole entire show is structured just so you can scream at each other and disagree on literally every single point. So I think if there's any real agenda for him to, any point for him to make, it's more about that than specifically like vote for this person or vote for that person.
Yeah, I would just want to be clear. I don't expect them to say vote for this person or vote for that person. That would be absurd. But I do feel that part of what they're consistently targeting is a kind of abject hypocrisy, of a flagrant dishonesty, determined superficiality about stuff that really matters. That range of conversation that Baratunde talked about, of how the healthcare debate was discussed. And I mean, the amount of moral outrage or sort of fake moral outrage that was generated by let's try to take better care of people with our medical system was probably 10 times as great as the outrage against the wars that we got into, which were demonstrably based on falsehoods, at least the Iraq War. That's just a country and a political discourse that's completely out of control and psychotic. And so I'm not suggesting they should say, well, so remember who to pull the lever for, But I do feel like they have the opportunity and a lot of cultural attention to direct people towards what really matters, even if that's not what their shows can do. What really matters is policy and what, who's advocating which policies and in whose interests, and who's a serious political/moral actor versus a demagogue or a pundit, right?
Can I ask a question of the audience? It's a real question. We can keep it short if you have more coming this way, because we're here to talk in theory. But this is a media and communications school, yeah? International Affairs, like I said.
You were close.
There goes my smart question. Now it's a dumb question.
But we have a media and culture concentration, so it's our focus within international affairs, yes.
Back on top.
Do you need to go back and change all your answers from before?
No, everything I said was a lie, but I made money off of it. That was a creepy level of enthusiasm, am I right? Here's my real question. We've got this assumed premise that was made explicit by you and tagged on by me that the media is more broken now than it's ever been. Is that really true? Is that true over the past 10 years, 30 years, 50 years, 200 years? I mean, what were newspapers like? I wasn't around, and I haven't really fully studied the history of newspapers. I don't think they were shining beacons of hope and justice on a hill. I feel like they were probably run by and owned by a bunch of assholes who had their agenda, and they used their newspapers as weapons. Maybe things were never as great as we imagined them to be, but I'd love, especially to hear from you, but also from you guys, are we giving the premise a little too much strength?
Sort of inviting mutiny.
Against us.
I write for the school newspaper, actually. So, I mean, I'm kind of struggling with the same thing. And as far as news articles go, what exactly can you say without saying too much and putting, your words in someone else's mouth or in someone else's head? But I think that there have been, certain writers, maybe not so much newspapers, that have held their integrity or have thought, hey, this is really screwed up and I should say something about it, and they do that. And writers who have definitely made an impact or have, just said, these are my views and I'm going to stick to them no matter what. As far as papers go, I don't really think I could say that because, in the New York Times, as an example, now and back then have always, there's people who stick to the right and people who stick to the left. Even if they are writing straight news articles, you can see their views come out in it. And, you can kind of be like, okay, that's not right. They're trying to feed me something and I'm not buying into it. But I think there have definitely been, writers who say one thing and, probably not so much papers. I don't think that at all. Just because, things change over time and I don't think papers, probably not.
I think standards have gone way downhill because the news cycle, it used to be I think there are a lot of good points. I honestly think part of it, the thing about newspapers going away and the internet taking over is that, I'm sorry, am I interrupting someone else who want to talk?
Can you guys please fight? Right now.
You know what, I'm going to put a pin in that and I'm going to let you move the microphone over this, John. Sorry. I made my point enough, people. It's clear what I was inferring.
No, I didn't want to take that away from you. I was interested in what you had to say. But...
oh, snap!
Wow.
What?
Oh, we'll have words
real at
afterwards.
the panel.
This guy's in shorts, and he did that to you.
He knows how to use the microphone.
All right, we
better
haven't
than
had any
anyone.
wine yet. Let's go.
Loafers, yeah. No, I was really interested in what you had to say about the Fourth Estate and where it is right now and what everybody else has asked. But I think what you have to look at if you want to know how much integrity is involved in the media organization is where the money's coming from. And there's a big gradient here on the panel right now of where the money's coming from because I have no idea how you guys make money or pay for what you do. And you're part of a direct institution. I mean, you're part of it. And you're part of
the man.
You're a guy that writes books. And so it's like... I'm
even have a
sorry.
label
I
for
should
you.
almost be in a cage.
He just described you.
This antiquity.
But you have a lot more freedom. You have considerable more freedom, and the things you say have some real power to them because you don't have anybody holding a dollar over your head. In some ways. Anyway, the point I wanted to get at was, so there's an organization that does a lot of interesting free media stuff, and you guys have heard of it, obviously WikiLeaks, and they had an opportunity to go on a comedy show, but weirdly enough, that comedy show has real strong ties with the state, and it was called Baratunde. And it got a real weird treatment, and it was an awkward conversation. And I kind of wanted to flip the question back on you guys. What do you guys think about how much where your money comes from or how you make your money influences what you can and what you do?
Wow, that's a good question.
I have no money.
But he does have an
I
iPad.
can do whatever I want.
With a blue case.
No, there's, I mean, again, Onion has been around for actually 22 years. It started as an independent student newspaper at University of Wisconsin in Madison. It's always been supported by advertising, sometimes more successful than others. Went from print paper to online video, to radio stuff, and the freedom of, excuse me, of our writers is tantamount, because without that, our brand is nothing, right? You start having, advertisers say, you can't do that, or some other business person, they don't have that level of, direct oversight of the material that comes out. There are things that don't run. And I'm not gonna say there's never been a case of that, but by and large, I think there's a wide range of freedom to say what the writers think needs to be said, what the editors thinks needs to be said. We're not gonna go half-cocked and do something not funny. We're not gonna go out of our way to antagonize a relationship either. So there's some grayness, but in general, you can kind of see the coverage for yourself and ask it for pulling punches because of financial concerns. Probably not. Yeah.
For us, the primary concern for how we choose our material has always been who is going to be the greatest unintentional singer. And with that concern in mind, we generally leave no stone unturned. And overall, over the past year and a half, we've seen our budget grow from $0 to nearly more than $0. And that has begun to influence us in terms of whether or not we get cream cheese on our bagels. But we have yet to see it influence the material we select.
We've also, the four of us have finally unionized. It's a very small union. So our days are shorter. We have real weekends now. And once we're finished shooting in the dinette, it's part of union rules. We have to move the kitchen table back in. So
Yeah, it's a serious question. Like, these guys at some point, Chrysler or some big fucking BP is going to go, will you guys auto-tune an ad with, and you guys are going to have to go, oh, let's think about that, because we could make $1 zillion. But the larger guiding principle for all media companies, I know there's people enjoy saying, well, this is a left-wing paper, a right-wing paper, like the tradition of 19th century newspapers where you knew the political cast that the organ was coming from, so to speak. I don't think that's the case anymore. I mean, I think the Wall Street Journal is demonstrably a right-wing newspaper. I think their ownership, I think that's their slant on everything. It's a business paper, But I think most newspapers and websites and TV stations are really just the bottom line. It's just profit. And if it is profitable to create a story or to chase a story about Sarah Palin's latest tweet, then that's what they'll do, without the least bit of consideration given to whether that is really something that matters. I think the question that used to be asked was, does this matter to our readership or to our viewers? And the question that now asks is, will it sell? Will it stimulate? So that's the guiding principle. As for me and thinking about, how do I make money, or sort of, I'm fortunately far enough on the cultural margin. I'm actually so far on the cultural margin I can see over the edge of it. Like, I'm just right there. So there's not a lot of money attached to what I do. And I actually started making books myself, partly because it was really dumb to ask a corporation to invest in me, basically. But I hope I'll have a chance to read one of these letters, but the one that I'm happiest about, which is this new one, is called Letters from People Who Hate Me. And I got hundreds and hundreds of letters. And so my effort in this little book, which I sell for $5 to feed my children, sadly, but I'm actually serious, is to try to take account of what is out there politically and morally and emotionally and psychologically in the country and respond to it. So I'll read one of these letters. So this is in response to this piece I wrote. It was in the Boston Globe. The letter starts, "Dear asshole, You're a fucking idiot. And your daughter in the picture on your website looks like a maggot. You're a disgraceful American, and it would have been so nice if you had been a passenger on one of the planes that crashed into one of the World Trade Towers on 9/11. Signed, Joseph Kelly. That's not the worst of them. Dear Joseph, okay, you got me. My daughter does have kind of a maggoty look to her. For a while there, my wife and I were able to delude ourselves. I guess all parents do. We'd tell people her skin was alabaster or sometimes pearlescent. We thought it might be the kind of soap we were using. But I think in our heart of hearts, we knew something was wrong with her. Then came her first interaction with carrion. There was some kind of dead animal in our backyard. My wife says it was a rabbit, but I'm almost certain it wasn't a possum. Anyway, Josephine somehow got wind of it, and we found her out there burrowing into the thing's eye socket. The neighbors came out to watch. It was kind of awkward. I guess it would be sort of like if you, Joseph Kelly, found yourself talking to some buddies at a party and you said, you know that guy Steve Almond, I totally wish he'd been killed in the 9/11 attacks. And this voice behind you says, yeah, totally, we should have killed that filthy infidel Almond. And you turn around hoping to maybe give the guy a high five, only to discover that it's Osama bin Laden. So, and it goes on and on, but a book like this is not going to make anybody in a corporation any money. It's too strange. It's too full of a really authentic. I mean, what I find these letters kind of really beautiful in a weird way, or I should say just really tragic, because they are a direct transcription of a way that a significant percentage of this country constructs reality. They believe that Obama's middle-of-the-road policies are like Nazi policies, and that he's a foreign-born, crazy. They believe that. I mean, I think a fourth of the people on one survey believed that he was the Antichrist. Now, they are a significant part of the political discourse of this country. They dominate the media coverage, as we've all been talking about. They make for great laughs, but they also, as the Tea Party movement has revealed, are significant moral and political actors. They're the reason that discussion about health care was about something that was demonstrably false, this myth of death panels, and that was sort of the normative story that had to be discussed, rather than who's going to benefit and what are the inequalities when you turn over health care to a private industry. So I sort of got myself far afield, but my point is that a book that's this moral in a weird way and this scary about what's really happening in America, I just don't want a corporation to be involved with it. I don't want them to think they're going to make any money on it, because they won't. So.
Here's $5.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Capitalism, baby. That's awesome.
Questions?
And over here somewhere, right? Yeah, there you go.
You guys got to improve your communication.
Okay.
That was totally in it.
Right there in the
Friends.
third row. Yeah.
Yeah, can I pick up on the question about about the history? I think if you look at Lippmann's book in the 1920s, Public Opinion, he does a brief analysis of newspapers and suggests that most of it is full of scandal and sport and very, very little actual news. So we all construct golden ages. But at the same time, if you look at American newspapers in the early 1970s, they actually spent some money on finding stuff out. And
Like Watergate.
If you think about something like the fairness doctrine, however rough and ready a measure it is, at least says broadcasting has a set of responsibilities.
Yes.
So I think we do need to look at history. You could look at my lovely book, Mediating Politics, if you want to find out more about this.
I like this guy. Capitalism.
Please note the gentleman with the accent roasting the Americans on American history. That's right here, guys.
But the question I really wanted to raise then, taking those things into account, taking, I'll use Steve, your name, because I didn't quite pick up your surname. Steve's points, which I broadly agree with.
Are you from this country?
That's right, yeah. What's to be done? if we take this question of the morality and the ethics and the knowledge and the understanding we want to get from media, what is to be done in the United States?
I want to answer in like 30 seconds, and then, well, I want to talk more about the intersection of comedy and politics, but you mentioned the fairness doctrine. The fairness doctrine was in place. It is essentially a rule that says anytime there's a discussion on the public airwaves that is obvious public importance, a controversial issue, it should be talked about responsibly. That is, both sides should be presented. And that was done away with, as with so much else, by Reagan, and it really created the right-wing talking industry, the hateocracy is what I think of it as, which has really, if you think about it, has driven not just the comedy shows, but has driven the general discourse. Every time there's a discussion, because these guys, whoever it is, Hannity or any of them, what they can't stand is actually, what they're selling is moral assurance. That's what they're selling to their frightened, insecure viewers, that somebody knows the answers and just listen to them and you'll be fine. And you're a victim and America's great and don't feel guilty for a second. What needs to happen is the fairness doctrine needs to be put back in place, because their power would evaporate if they were actually confronted by somebody with a command of the facts who wasn't afraid of their bullying. Their authority as speakers, we wouldn't be listening to them. Glenn Beck would be in his basement shouting at his furniture, as he should be, rather than being on the cover of Time magazine. And Ann Coulter would, finally work up the nerve and come out as a dominatrix, tranny, and we'd all be talking, at least a little bit anyway, about stuff that really matters more to the political discourse.
Like Snooki.
Like Snooki, exactly.
Anybody else want to add to that or say something about?
Sure. You want the answer to everything. I think that was your question, right? How do we fix it all? There are a lot of elements to this situation which have led us to be where we are. The money question is a big part of it. And I do think, with the limited history, I know that there is something a little different about our media culture, given the ownership structures of them, given the level of competition on top of that ownership structure, and how cross-owned they are with the entities that they're supposed to be covering for us. That is an undeniable sort of corporate and economic fact. So, there's the creation of your own media and kind of creating an alternative system over here or out there, and that's happening. I mean, you have great reporting coming out of, I can't remember the name of the organization. What's that? Christian Science Monitor. No, that is a good one. I'm thinking there's a nonprofit organization that, ProPublica, does amazing work. Actually, Good Magazine does amazing work in terms of presenting really complex ideas visually. It's still stimulating, but you're learning. So I think there are ways to funnel your attention and your dollars into alternate media systems that are doing a better job, other than mocking the system that's not doing the best job.
Right. Yeah. And that's the key, is that you can complain we can sit up here and bitch about how dumb the media is and so forth. It's our fault. You vote with your time and your attention and your money. You're voting. Every time you click on a link, as one of these right-wing demagogues, you are building their empire. And they know it. They're laughing at you. So it's ultimately the public's decision. We're responsible for the political discourse we have. I think people can push the needle one way or the other, like Stewart and Colbert, but ultimately it comes down to individual decisions of how you're going to spend your time and how seriously you're going to take your role as a citizen.
By the way, there was a new poll that came out, The Onion covered. 1 in 5 Americans believe Obama's a cactus.
A dire statistic.
It's really frightening.
Hi. I run a website that makes fun of wingnuts. And this is a question that I'm kind of struggling with, and I wonder what your take on it is. That kind of in the effort to get a joke and to get to laugh, do we run a risk of kind of dropping our compassion for one another and for our political opponents in the public space? And how do you balance that? Because I think that's a real question. I mean, I think of things like James O'Keefe, the kid who did the Acorn thing. I think that kid thought that was hilarious, but those people lost their jobs. close down this organization that helped people, and how do we kind of police that line, I guess, civilly, amongst ourselves, so that it doesn't go too far, or things like charade or things like this happen, where it really does damage to people's lives, as opposed to just being like a kind of a caricature of what they are.
Oh, I was going to have a bit of a lark by saying, I think one of the most compassionate things we can do is offer a laugh to people, which is, the pursuit of all of us in some way or another up here. But with regard to the idea that we do a disservice to people that we either make fun of or make jokes about, I think it bears a bit of a connection to when Baratunde and Steve were talking about what drives attention and what underlies the foundation of all the different media outlets in terms of whether or not it's a corporation funding them. It might not necessarily be the fact that, say, Fox News is connected to other corporate outlets or whatever, but it might just be ratings alone. Histrionics get attention. And so blubbering on screen or having pumped up emotion, whether or not it's deserved, will get attention. You'll always watch someone crying and yelling, even whether you meant to, before you'll watch someone giving a very measured account of a real issue. So,
it's called reality TV.
Yes, in fact. So, I guess what I meant to say is, we can't even help that. We can't help our natural urges to watch people yelling at each other. And so increasingly we may have some reliance on organizations like ProPublica was mentioned, specifically because they're a nonprofit. And in some way, whether it's governmentally or collectively as a society, we would have to support outlets for journalism that are not bound to corporate sponsors, but also not bound to advertising dollars, even though those may not be of political stripe.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for people to use their power as entertainers or comedians, a little like that's what Chaplin was doing. He could have just stuck to doing pratfalls, although I think he was always very much a comedian who was about poverty and economic inequality. But a lot of what he did and a lot of the reason he was popular is because he knew how to take a good fall. But at a certain point, as I think has happened with Colbert and Stewart and Chris Rock and Richard Pryor and all these comedians are kind of heartbroken people. They're moralists and idealists who are heartbroken at what they see around them. Vonnegut, you can just go down the list. And at a certain point, I think, hopefully the idea is you get a certain audience by being incredibly funny and having an eye for hypocrisy and so forth, and then you use that power that you have culturally to try to direct people towards what really matters to the democracy. And that's regardless of your political orientation. It's really a sort of moral calculation you make at a certain point.
Well, I think we've given pretty even-handed treatment up here. I think we've got political views from all sides of the spectrum, as you can see. It's a pretty right-wing crowd up here.
Another question? Is there over there?
Hi, I'm curious as to what you guys have to say, in particular you, Mr. Almond, about what you think this infotainment, whether it's helpful or more hazardous to society as a whole, as far as filling kind of the vacuum or that more, or creating or providing a moral backstop that we have, I guess, lacked to or have yet to develop. I don't know if that was clear. So I'm wondering if we have Fox News providing all this editorial stuff, say on the right, and maybe Colbert and Jon Stewart say more to the left, and they're kind of competing ideas, but because it's providing this entertainment, these editorials, there's no room to grow outside of that, possibly, and I'm wondering what you guys have to say about that. If that was clear, I apologize.
No, I think it was clear, and I think this is one of the this rally will be one of these moments where it'll be interesting to see whether to what extent they step out of that box as entertainers and remind people, however cleverly, that they're all, that they're really morally concerned people. But again, that's against what they do. And I mean, the problem with Fox News isn't that it exists; it reflects the views of a significant portion of the population. The problem is that all anybody else talks about in the fucking media is the latest crazy thing on Fox News. That's the problem. The brain dead are given megaphones, really, to use, and the mean. It's like, into the widening gyre. The best lacked all conviction, and the crazies are the ones who are sort of have the loudest voices. And I think the way you counteract that, both in the media and in your lives, is just by resisting the urge to follow things because of a kind of prurient concern. Like, I read about Sarah Palin, I can't stop myself. It's like a bad, lousy addiction, because I want to see her. It activates some awful grievance in me that's in fact a mirror of the grievance on the other side and their outrage. And I just have to make better decisions, as an individual. But I also feel like I hope that, anybody who's smart enough as a comedian to gain some cultural power is going to use it in a way that will remind people that after the party and after we've all finished laughing at the absurdity, like, we got a country to run and a shitload of serious problems that are unprecedented. I mean, in the 19th century, they weren't dealing with peak oil. They weren't dealing with global warming. They weren't dealing with a bunch of stuff that is demonstrably leading to the potential end of the species, with a lot of crazy bloodshed to happen before that. I think the stakes are actually higher, and the discussion of it generates a lot of great laughs, but it's kind of like a Weimar Republic kind of laugh. It's like this weird decadence. And the question is whether, again, people who gain some cultural power by mocking that are able to step outside of that box and urge people to make better, more responsible decisions without sounding as earnest and moralizing as I am right now.
We have two questions now.
Kind of in that same vein about the responsibility of comedians, my question concerns the responsibility of comedians who don't have a media outlet, who don't have television shows, the likes of George Carlin when he was alive, and Richard Pryor when he was alive, and all these great guys that have
Bill Hicks.
Bill Hicks, my
Probably
God,
the best
please.
example,
Like, the first major comedian that I was ever introduced to was Bill Hicks. These guys that talked about politics and that talked about the concerns of the other large majority of people who care about this other side of politics and this other side of the human condition, that didn't have television shows and that didn't have radio programs. And for those comedians that are coming around today, like Louis C.K., and also Bill Maher with Louis.
Baratunde.
It's really, I'm gonna see him in November. And also even Bill Maher, that does have a television show, but also still does stand-up comedy. And really, what their responsibility is as comedians who are not necessarily political, but talk about these matters and who don't have this this outlet, this major camera outlet.
I don't think
the media.
The size of their outlet has anything to do with their responsibility, unless I'm mishearing you. And I don't think their responsibility is up to us. They're artists. Their job is to be great artists.
Right.
Period. It's not their job to run the country. It's not their job to solve the problems. Bill Hicks' job was to articulate and speak in a way that connected to others who couldn't say it the way he could. And that's true for any form of art. Painters do it, poets do it, writers do it, sculptors do it, and you see something in their work that speaks to you in a way that couldn't have been said another way. So it's a message. And I think there are artists who've crossed the activist line. Dick Gregory definitely crossed that line. And that was a part of his practice as an artist, was to also act. But I think the responsibility is independent of the size of your audience. And to the extent that there is a responsibility, it's to be true to the art that you're doing, not to our ideas of the fact that they're talking about politics means there's some responsibility to act. I don't think we can put that on them. I think it's nice when people, it can be great when people do it, it can fail horribly when people do it. But I don't know that I feel comfortable having a conversation saying this is the responsibility of a political comedian, because it's their take.
What I think about is cool about those comedians is their freedom. I mean, we had the question about, you know, where are people's advertising dollars coming from? Can Comedy Central? I mean, people like George Carlin and Bill Hicks, I mean, someone had already bought the tickets to the show. Like, they aren't going to get a refund if they don't like the jokes.
Yeah. Yeah, they're responsible to their audience, I suppose.
But Pryor did have a show briefly, right? On network television. He did. I mean, it didn't last very long, but he did have a show.
Carlin had one too, in the early 90s.
I think it's right there, yeah.
Hi, I just had a quick question. Someone had kind of said this, and I was a professor, but do y'all, I'm bad with microphones. Do y'all think that the traditional kind of social movement of the past is dead? And if so, or if not so, do you think it's kind of been replaced by this whole idea we've been talking about of Fox News versus MSNBC and Comedy Central? Do you think that's kind of the trade-off, or what's your take on it?
This started as a panel about comedy.
Dude, that question's
Remember
hilarious.
that?
That question's, I'm writing 5 jokes right now. This is hilarious. Social movements. Killing me.
What would you define as like a social movement of the past? What's an example?
You had said, yeah.
Well, I think maybe, again, I'm not sort of, it's not about, you know, you're right. We shouldn't put all this weight on artists to, as you say, run the country or be public representatives. But it is true that there was in this country, I mean, the 1930s, the union movement, the 1960s, I mean, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, you know.
The auto-tune movement.
The auto-tune. So there is, but there is a point where here, and some people would argue that kind of, just by the way, earlier when you asked the audience about, has it always been this way? Well, yes, there was like all that yellow press of the 1800s, and there was a moment in the early 20th century where American journalism became professional. You know, journalism schools, that's why you get Columbia Journalism School. This stuff hasn't been there forever. And yes, there was that like responsibility, the stuff of the early 1970s. It is true that with cable television, the rise of cable TV and so on, especially Fox, right? CNN is a kind of precursor, but definitely Fox is part of it, that it created a different kind of environment. So to bring it back to her point, there is a way in American politics whereby sort of beginning, I suppose, the late 80s, early 90s, where politics has become about sort of individuals. So it could be anybody from like Barack Obama to Al Sharpton to people, when people are thinking seriously about like, so what we want to have a different kind of society that's caring, that has maybe single payer healthcare, that is about our children, that is about proper public education, that doesn't just say it's the fault of the teachers, you know, so having a better kind of debate, they latch onto an individual rather than these are sort of media-driven kind of movements, and it's always about an individual. So the question is often asked here, like, do we wait here for some kind of figure, but there's no more, and I know this is not about comedy, but people don't build movements from the ground up away from the cameras. If it's not in front of the cameras, it doesn't count anymore in America. So like you can have like, you know, Al Sharpton has no, I don't want to besmirch because it's on tape, but you can question about Al Sharpton's like base. But Al Sharpton is always, like last week, like Cuomo, there's like a story in the paper, Cuomo is not responsive to the needs of minorities in New York State. And by the second paragraph, Al Sharpton said it. And you're like, what constituency? You know, it's just sort of, it's clear like they needed a quote, they ran to Al Sharpton. So I'm just saying it's like there's a weird world, and if it's not on TV, if it's not definitely it's not even anymore if it's in the paper, but if it's not on TV, it's not some viral thing on the internet, it doesn't make a movement. You know, you can't build a movement away from the cameras anymore.
Well, I think for a movement to be successful in this media age, you have to have, like, there has to be some sort of charismatic personality behind it. It's no longer enough to be a good writer because people just don't read. You know, it's all about the visuals and things like that. I mean, I'm sorry, but like the election of Barack Obama, a good part of it was because he is an extremely energizing, charismatic figure. He also happens to be one who's very intelligent and reasonable, and that's great. But one comment I was going to make earlier was that as part of tying it back to comedy, just two quick things. Like, for example, the Colbert appearance before Congress. He was doing it in character, and he was doing it for laughs, but he was definitely also doing it because he knew that by his appearing in front of Congress, a session about migrant workers that never would have been buried on C-SPAN 2, that no one would have paid attention to, now all of a sudden is making national headlines. And even though a lot of the talk has been about whether or not it was appropriate for him to show up, there's still, you know, they still got 10 times more attention onto that issue than they ever would have. So even if some of the conversation is about that, there's enough bleed off from his appearance that people knew what his appearance was about, what he was talking about. The other point I want to make, and this is a little bit tangential, but I do think that we do live in an era where to become president of the United States, I actually think that you have to be able to have a decent sense of humor and be able to tell a joke. I mean, when you're on the campaign trail, you're expected to go on Letterman, on Leno, on Saturday Night Live at this point as well. And if you can't deliver, and also the president has to give a speech at the White House Correspondents' Dinner following Stephen Colbert or Jay Leno or whoever, and they have to deliver essentially like a comic roast.
They have to be an entertainer.
Yeah, exactly. And I think ever since Reagan, who did have a good sense of humor, and like Clinton, Barack Obama, I think they all have really, even Bush, I think could deliver a joke relatively well. If you can't do that anymore, then, I mean, honestly, I think if Kerry had a decent sense of humor, he would have won the election, but he was so stiff that it's like people don't want that person as their president. There's a relatability in comedy that if you can't deliver a joke, people are like, I don't.
There's even that huge pre-election roast that both McCain and Obama did here in New York City in 2008, where I think it's on 57th. I don't remember where it is.
Was it Baruch College or something like that?
Yeah, I don't.
Right, like McCain has an amazing sense of humor, and it's one of those things where it's like, even though I don't agree with him politically, I like him more as a person because I know he can deliver a joke and get a joke, and he had the balls to host Saturday Night Live as a sitting senator. I think when I look at the politicians who were sitting there listening to Colbert give testimony and no one was laughing, and he has the confidence to know that what he's saying is funny and he's not going to waver. It was the same thing at the roast of the president. He knew what he was saying was funny, and so he's just like, you know, for comedians to not get a laugh, that's a huge, like, oh my God, what, I'm flopping, this is terrible. You know, it's like Imus with Clinton, they start sweating and freaking out, and he's so amazing because he just had this utter confidence that he knew what he was saying was funny and was going to land on the internet and on television, if not in the room. But watching these politicians just look at him humorless and stone-faced, the most tragic thing about the whole thing is that he's not up on the dais, and you know those morons aren't down in the audience listening to him, because just as someone who's worked for both Jon and Stephen, I can say these guys are so much smarter, more literate, more morally centered, more in touch with sort of, just reality than the congressmen who were sitting up there sort of not really getting what Stephen was doing. The sort of tragedy is that we live in a political environment where, unfortunately, sane people like that would never actually put themselves up for office because of what they have to go through. But yeah, they'd be much better at running this country than the people who currently are.
And that question about movements, like I went to a healthcare rally. I mean, I should say, millions of people protested the Iraq War around the globe. Millions did, and there was. Right, including in this country. 75,000 people protested for gay rights, a couple of weeks before Glenn Beck's thing, and it was a blip. So part of it is the filter, the media filter. We just love crazy, angry white people, and doing crazy stuff. I went to a healthcare rally, sort of in support of healthcare and trying to push it towards maybe, you know, it was to a bunch of Democratic politicians, and I brought my kid and I put on his onesie, like, my sick grandma wants healthcare. I was like, okay, this is the thing I'm going to do to try and get the cameras to pay attention, because I know I got to play that game in this media environment. And you know, there was one camera crew there. There was probably 2,000 or 3,000 people. There's one camera crew there for like 10 minutes, and I waved my baby frantically.
Please tell me you shook your baby.
And I did. I shook my baby. And then I realized, you know, the only thing that would have worked is if I'd strapped a gun on the child, maybe drawn on a little Hitler mustache, and say, I'm rootin' tootin' for healthcare, you know, whatever. That would have been the thing. You literally have to be that crazy to kind of get, you know, to get the YouTube moment. And that has to do with the choices we're making as to what we consider, you know, what our threshold for being entertained is, and the extent to which we're sort of treating the world in the ironic mode as something that's there to just entertain us. It's not, I mean, the media filter only works because we submit to it and go, look at the crazy hamster playing piano, you know.
But that's also awesome.
Have you seen the hamster?
Underestimating the awesomeness of a hamster.
The hamster is almost as good as that Hitler baby that guy was waving.
I'll pay you money to bring a Hitler baby on YouTube. That's awesome.
I think we have one last question. Yeah. Unless you want to
Make
keep
it
on
great.
A lot of pressure. A lot of pressure on you.
Come on, last question.
So you guys are just saying kind of that like politicians have to be comedians, but do comedians who involve politics in their comedy have to be politicians?
Yes,
Like,
absolutely. No
you know, you guys.
We came here actually to announce that we're running for office.
I'll vote for you.
But you have to vote for both of them. You have to vote for the collection, the four, actually, right?
You guys are hired.
I feel like The Onion and, you know, Daily Show and Colbert Report obviously kind of have, it's like more obvious political commentary to me than like Auto-Tune the News. You know, that is just like a really funny appropriation of existing political media. You know, like, I don't know if you guys have to be on a panel to talk about double rainbows, you know. So I'm just curious if you think that you can involve politics in comedy without like having to make political statements. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah, double rainbows are rarely involved in panels.
or politics.
Not yet.
But it's like, you know, you guys kind of do a lot of things with your stuff online. And are you intending to make political statements with Auto-Tune the News?
Okay, so I think we boiled it down there at the end. Are we intending to make political statements with Auto-Tune the News? And I alluded to this earlier, but our primary goal is to make musical statements. But often in doing so, you know, we have been blessed to showcase people with interesting, shall we say, or absurd points of view in the political sphere. And so by showcasing how wonderfully they may sing their point of view, we can often, even without making the statement directly ourselves, infer the statement and showcase a little bit of silliness or absurdity in what's going on. So there's perhaps it's not a statement, perhaps it's just a suggestion, but you know there are things there.
We're curating, really.
I would like to thank our panelists, and I'd like to thank the audience, and I'd like to
and thank Sean.
Especially, I'd like to thank Lorena Ruiz for her great work.